please welcome Robin Dale, Deputy Librarian in the Library of Congress Collections and Services Group.
Good evening, everyone. As you heard, I'm Robin Dale, and I am the Deputy Librarian for Library Collections and Services here at the Library of Congress. And like many of you in the audience today, I am also a huge fan of Geraldine Brooks. So last summer, Robert Newland, our acting Librarian of Congress, had the honor of appointing Geraldine Brooks to be the winner of the library's 2025 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. Now, I know that her latest book, Memorial Days, which is nonfiction and beautiful nonfiction at that, but the prize is awarded based on a writer's entire career. I've spent many hours entering a vivid and thoughtful and suspenseful fictional works that Geraldine creates from lived history. And I'm so thankful for her for allowing me and many, many other readers to feel like I've lived in other times than right now, and in other worlds as well. Geraldine has a gift, a very rare gift. She's won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction, and her books have been translated into more than 30 languages. She's in conversation tonight with our friend Ron Charles, a longtime Ron is a longtime critic for the Washington Post who now writes for his Substack newsletter. There will be time tonight for audience Q&A, and I encourage you to join Geraldine at her signing in the Whittle Pavilion next door to this auditorium at 8 p.m. Thank you for joining us at the Library of Congress, and now please help me welcome Geraldine and Ron to the stage.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, what a pleasure.
I have been a fan of Geraldine Brooks since 2005, when I got a hold of a galley of a novel called March. And breaking all book reviewer rules, I tracked down her phone number, and I called her from the newsroom, and I said, I just love your book. I think I may have been crying at the time. I always just seemed completely unbalanced to you. So it's been a long, long time of loving your fiction, and I'm so pleased to have you here tonight, and congratulations on this prize.
Well, thank you, and I have to say that your review of March was my favorite one, and I actually quote a line from it, which I may be butchering at this point, given that it's been a minute, but you're talking about Bronson Alcott and his significance to American philosophy, and you say if Emerson and Thoreau were the shooting stars of American idealism, Bronson Alcott was the dark matter from which they drew their energy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to cry again now. So what is a nice Australian woman like you doing in an American prize like this? Huh?
Well, at certain times, this country has been very generous to immigrants.
In 1837, Ralph Waldo Emerson told students at Harvard, "We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe." And a few years later, he called for the emergence of a writer capable of capturing America's incomparable materials, our ample geography, which dazzles the imagination. You've been all over the world. You've written so many books, fiction and nonfiction. Is there something essentially American about our fiction?
You know, growing up in Australia, the bookshelves of my childhood were garrisoned by foreign troops. We didn't have a robust literature of our own in those days, and particularly children's literature. So I grew up reading, and I have to say most of it was English writers, to the extent that when I read Little Women as a 10-year-old, I thought it was an English novel because that was what we were given. And you know, you grow up in a place that you've never seen snow, barely a frost, and you know, you're hearing about these weather events, and you're hearing about rowan trees and lisle stockings and things that you have no experience of. So I think that the downside of that was not seeing yourself reflected in your community, and that's all changed, thank God, in these many years. But the upside of it is that it makes you very outward looking and open to the world and open to receiving what the world has to offer. And so by the time I hit university, it was all about American literature for me. And American politics, I have to say, it became something of an obsession. And you know, full disclosure, my father was an American. My father migrated to Australia by accident, in fact.
Did you get on the wrong plane, or what?
He was a singer, an entertainer, and he had got into a spot of scandalous bother in Hollywood, and had fled to Honolulu, where he became the singer in residence at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. And then he got into another spot of bother and had to get on a boat that took him even further away. And so he was touring Australia, and they got halfway across the country. They had performed in Adelaide. And he wakes up in the morning to find that the band leader had absconded with everybody's pay. And he had no way to get back to the States. So he started singing with Australian ensembles. And he was singing with one when news came through that Paris had fallen to the Nazis. And after their gig, all these Australian musos went out having adult beverages together. And as the night wore into the morning, they said, "We're going to enlist and fight those Nazi bastards." And my dad said, "Well, I'll enlist with you." And this American enlisted in the Australian Army and served and came back and met my mother, and that was that.
Wow. I did not know all that. I thought he was an editor. I thought your father was an editor.
He was a proofreader, actually. So, you know, I've never really figured out why, but at some point, my parents, she was a radio presenter, and they had a very glamorous life way before I was born, but for some reason, they turned their back on all that.
Wow. And what drew you to journalism?
My dad was working in a newspaper office, and when I was 8 years old, Mum took me to see where Dad worked, and he took me down to the press floor, and it was an incredibly overwhelming experience for an 8-year-old. The incredible noise of the linotype machines, you know, this was all the days of hot type, and the ink truck, and the air was misty with ink, and the gigantic rolls of newsprint, and when the foreman hit the button for the afternoon edition, and this paper's just spinning across the room, and the newspapers start landing on the conveyor belt, and Dad reached out and got one and handed it to me, and it was warm. It was hot off the press. And I looked down at those big black headlines, and I thought, I am the first one that knows what's going on in this city right now. And I just wanted that, and so I just went after that.
And you became a foreign correspondent. What was it about that you enjoyed so much?
I didn't intend to be a foreign correspondent. So, you know, careers are like car crashes in some ways. I wanted to be a reporter for my hometown newspaper, and it was a fantastic experience because, you know, we lived a pretty limited life. We hadn't had a car when I was growing up. We never went anywhere. So to get to know first my own city and then my country, because I started covering environmental issues, and I would go out and, you know, to the outback and then to the wild rainforests of Tasmania and all these places. Various environmental battles were going on, and I loved it. And I would have kept doing that happily forever, but I got a scholarship to come to Columbia Journalism School. And what a great opportunity that was. And I was going to do the degree and then go home and get on with my real life.
Someday.
And I met two people who derailed that, and one of them was the recruiter for the Wall Street Journal, and the other one was Tony Horwitz. And Rita, I married him. And so the Wall Street Journal was kind of, I had applied for an internship. I heard that they had summer interns. I thought, oh, another 3 months to hone my journalism skills, and then I'll go back to Sydney and get on with my real life. And I applied for this internship, and they said, you can't have it, you're too old. This is for college-age people, and you're a graduate student, and you've been working for 3 years, but we might consider you for a full-time job. And I thought, oh yeah, sure. But I went and talked to my journalism professor, and he said, when they interview you, they always ask the Cleveland question, which is, would you be willing to take this job if it meant relocating to Cleveland? And don't worry about it. It's just a test. They want to see how committed you are to the Wall Street Journal. So I go to the interview, they ask, I answer, and they send me there. And that was my first foreign assignment.
You could have kept being a foreign correspondent to this day if you wanted. What is it that turned you to the dark side of writing fiction?
I have the Nigerian secret police to thank for that. And I've told this story before, but I have to tell it because it's the truth. I loved the work of being a foreign correspondent, and I believed in it. And it was hard, and sometimes it was incredibly distressing because you're constantly seeing people at the worst moment of their life. You know, their country is being torn apart by war or famine or oppression, or, you know, and I'd been covering conflicts in the Middle East and in the Balkans, and then in Eritrea, Ethiopia. And a wonderful activist had come to New York and told the foreign editor about this situation in Nigeria where Shell Oil was allegedly in cahoots with the brutal military dictatorship of Sani Abacha, and that this peaceful protest movement of farmers whose lands had been completely polluted and destroyed by Shell, they'd been extracting billions in oil revenues from this region, and none of it had come back to the community. And so these incredibly poor subsistence farmers had done a sit-in, and Shell had called on Abacha to send in the military. And honestly, when the foreign editor told me this, I didn't credit it, because I thought, why would a major oil company do that? And so, you know, the Wall Street Journal, great paper that it is, sent me to check it out. And I found out it was worse than what had been described. I mean, the evidence was, there was a fiesta of terrible evidence of brutal massacre had happened. And so I collected all that evidence, and then, as you do as a reporter, I went to the Nigerian military to get their side of the story. And that didn't go over very well. And they handed me over to the secret police. And I was in the slammer in the unlovely city of Port Harcourt. And I had no idea how long they were going to keep me. And I thought, you're 39 years old and you forgot to get pregnant. And if they keep you, I was thinking of all the reporters who'd been detained for years. You blew it. So when they luckily deported me 3 days later, I went home and greeted Tony with great enthusiasm.
I'm sure I didn't ask about that.
Well, then I had an infant, and I didn't want to be going off on long, open-ended assignments where you might end up in the slammer or worse. And so I needed a new gig. And at first I thought, I'll write, magazine features. Maybe I could get a gig writing a celebrity profile lying around a swimming pool with Matt Damon. But if you spent 10 years, covering conflict, nobody thinks of you for that. And the only freelance offers I got were to go to Afghanistan with the Pashtun. And I'm like, I'm nursing a baby here every 4 hours. I don't think I can be doing that. And it was Tony who said, you've always talked about that village that we stumbled on when we were hiking in the Peak District, where bubonic plague arrived in 1665, and the villagers took the unique decision to quarantine themselves rather than flee like everybody else did, which led to spreading the plague. And they came together and decided to voluntarily quarantine, and they lived that way for a year. And you've been intrigued by that, why don't you try and write that? And that was Year of Wonders, and lucky for me, somebody wanted to read it.
Yeah, many people. As you look back at a very successful journalism career and a very successful fiction writing career, what has writing novels allowed you to do that journalism never did?
So journalism, to me, the purpose of the work was to show how the decisions that are made in the White House or in Whitehall actually play out in the lives of human beings. And it was a great responsibility to do that. But often when you're reporting, you know more than you can prove. You can't find the two confirming sources that you need to put something in print. And in fiction, you can follow the line of fact as far as it leads, but when the historical voices fall silent, or when those voices never had a chance to tell their own story, you can do all that research and you can figure out what you think might have happened, and you can just write it, and it's tremendously liberating.
Nice. So you've written 6 novels?
Mm-hmm.
All around the world, 300 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Where do you find subjects that interest you? Where do you find the seed for a new novel?
So they're lined up like air traffic control at LaGuardia. There are great ideas everywhere. And I love what Hemingway said. He said, an idea for a novel can be something you're lucky enough to overhear, or the wreck of your whole damn life. But for me, it's been mostly something I was lucky enough to overhear. Particularly my last novel, Horse, was just a gift from the gods. I had, having never ridden a horse, had become a horse obsessive at the ripe old age of 50, which I do not recommend. If you're going to become a horse nut, better you should do it at 15, or even better at 5 when you bounce. But I had been at a writer's retreat that was held on a ranch, and I had my first ecstatic experience on horseback, and then came home, and completely by coincidence, a young friend came over for dinner, and I told her how much I'd loved this experience, and she said, "You've got some land here, you could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." A free horse. Well, this free horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But I didn't care because it was a beautiful Palomino horse, and I knew this because it was in a television commercial. It was an ad for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infections. Palomino galloping across Mexican altiplano, voiceover. Some things should be fast. So I had a horse and I wasn't getting any writing done, and long story short, I was invited to a donor's lunch at Plymouth Pawtuxet Plantation, and I was schmoozing my donors, and down the other end of the table was a wonderful man from the Smithsonian Institution who had just delivered the skeleton of the most renowned racehorse of the 19th century from a forgotten spot in the attic of the Natural History Museum to pride of place in the exhibition on the history of the thoroughbred in Kentucky at the International Museum of the Horse. And this horse was the reason Kentucky became the center of thoroughbred breeding, because not only was it the fastest horse of its generation, it was also the greatest stud sire of any generation. Mm. And when he got up to the bit about what happened to that horse during the Civil War, my donors didn't have a scintilla of my attention, and my lunch was uneaten, and I knew I had my next book. So that's how you get an idea for a novel.
Pay attention. Yeah. It's possible to write a historical novel without doing any research.
Is it?
It is. Edward P. Jones famously said that he got a big stack of books to write The Known World. He read 50 pages of one book and decided that was enough of that.
It's such a great book.
Such a great book. But that's not your approach.
No, because I believe what Mark Twain said, which is, fiction is required to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. And the thing that actually happened will invariably be more interesting than anything you could make up. Oh. Like, in my novel Caleb's Crossing, if I had made up a Native American youth raised in his own language and culture and alleged that he mastered Latin and Greek and sat down and graduated with the sons of John Eliot and the other colonial Puritan elite, nobody would believe that. But it was true. And because it's true, it's all the more fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Henry James. Henry James. All your works have been dramatic works of historical reclamation and imagination, but Henry James, he once complained about the fatal cheapness of historical fiction. He warned, "You may multiply the little facts that can be got from pictures and documents and relics and prints, but that can't help an author with the invention, the representation of the old consciousness, the soul, the sense, the horizon, the vision of individuals in whose minds half the things that make ours, that make the modern world, were non-existent." How do you confront that challenge in your work when you're writing about people who are incredibly distant from us?
So I came across that quote, which is in a letter that he wrote to a novelist called Sarah Orne Jewett, who had sent him a manuscript of a historical novel for his comment. And that landed hard. And I remember going downstairs from my study and opening the fridge and looking for an adult beverage. And then I looked up Sarah Orne Jewett, and I found out that that novel she'd sent to Henry James was the last she ever wrote. Oh. And I thought, damn it, he discouraged her. But then I found out, no, what had actually happened was right after that correspondence, she'd been in a carriage accident and was very gravely injured. And I started to imagine her in that carriage, and I started to imagine the slide of the horse's hooves on maybe slippery spring mud in Maine, and the disarray of her starched skirt as she flew into the air, and the crunch of bone as she landed hard, and imagined her fear of death in that moment, and her pain and her frustration about not being able to do the work that she loved. And then I thought, a pox on you, Henry James, because this is what we do. It's not the things. I mean, a crash in a Tesla or a carriage accident, the thing isn't important. It's the human emotion. And that, I believe, doesn't change. I mean, hate and love and fear and wanting to live and wanting to see your children live, and those are the things that shape our consciousness, not the material goods, not whether the table's made of oak or synthetic plastic. It's a table, and we sit at it and we converse with each other and we share strong emotion.
You've proved that over and over again, so that's the best answer. When you're writing about a real person whose voice at the time was repressed or silenced, what kind of sense of responsibility do you have to that person or that type of person when you bring them alive in the modern age?
It's a big responsibility, and, you know, I'm very aware of the discourse around appropriation too. And a lot of the voices that were silenced were the voices of enslaved people who were not allowed to be taught to read and write. So we have so few accounts in people's own hand, in people's own words. Women who, you know, it's fascinating to me that early American journals by women do not exist, and partly that's because women were too busy doing every other damn thing than, you know, writing their pensées. But it's also because, interestingly, the Calvinists believed that it was a great thing for women to be able to read, so they could read their Bible to their children. But writing, well, that's a skill that you use to communicate with people outside the family, so why would any Puritan good wife need to be doing that? And so women weren't typically taught to write, and there's a wonderful book by Jill Lepore about Benjamin Franklin's sister, who was probably every bit as accomplished and brilliant as he, but she was never really, she was semi-literate, so her letters to him, she struggles to express herself.
I want to talk about the Civil War, which plays a part in two of your novels, a big part in two of your novels. And I wonder, what was it like for you to come upon the Civil War as an Australian, outside of growing up here, where we grew up with all the mythology of the Civil War, all its conflicted mythology? How did you come to the Civil War, and what did it seem to mean to you as an outsider?
I was dragged kicking and screaming. I married Tony Horwitz not realizing quite what I'd got myself into, which was kind of stupid on my part, because the family home here in Chevy Chase, his wonderful mother had allowed him to paint, when he was 8 years old, murals over the entire third floor, and it's the Battle of the Merrimack and the Monitor, and it's Gettysburg, and it's all these wonderful, vivid stick figures. So there were clues, but because we got married and immediately started vagabonding around the world as foreign correspondents, 4 years in Australia, 6 years covering the Middle East, and then on and on. It wasn't until Tony said, you know, we've been out of the country for a long time and I really need to water my roots, so I want to spend time near my family, and we ended up in Waterford, Virginia, which at that time was only an hour from DC. I understand it's now 2. But moving to Virginia, there's a saying, the Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, and it soon became apparent to me that Tony was going to drag me to every single one. And I was kind of churlish, you know, Antietam again, Gettysburg on the 4th of July, it's so hot, you know. And I, you know, sometimes I wouldn't even get out of the car. But then I realized that I was going to have to find a way to connect with this great, passionate interest of his. And I found it because what really did interest me about the Civil War was something that interested me as a foreign correspondent, which is what happens to idealists when they go to war. You know, the young people who I met in foxholes in the first Gulf War, many of them had signed up after 9/11, you know, great idealism. In the Civil War, many were abolitionists, many weren't, but many were abolitionists. And our little village of Waterford had a contingent of Quakers who felt so strongly about abolition that they were read out of Quaker meeting because they took up arms to fight on the Union side. So it was this exploration of what happens to an idealist who goes to war and then finds themselves required to do the brutal things that happen in any war, and the moral challenges and moral injuries. And that was, I was thinking about that when it occurred to me that there was this incredible found object in literature, which was the absent father in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, who is an idealist who's gone to war. And I went back to that book, and we hear hardly anything. We know he's gone, we know he's too old to go, we know he gets very ill, life-threateningly ill, and then he comes home. And he goes around the room and tells each of his little women how he thinks the year he's been away has changed them. But what that year did to him, nothing said. So there was the void that I felt that I could work in.
And what was it like around the kitchen table for a historian and a novelist to both be writing about the Civil War? How did that conversation go some days?
Well, the beauty of it was I had this in-house research. I mean, Tony's Civil War library was wonderfully extensive, and I'd always been taking those books off the shelves and putting them in boxes, and then I found myself up in the attic getting them out of the boxes and putting them back on the shelves, and that library now lives at Gettysburg College, actually. So, and Tony just knew everything. So you want to talk about the fate of the contraband, which was the name of the formerly enslaved people who came within Union lines before the Emancipation Proclamation. So what was the status of these people? They weren't exactly free, but they weren't exactly enslaved anymore. And so if Tony didn't know, he knew where to go to find out. So this was really good, and it kind of saved the marriage, really.
Nice. As you suggested, several of your novels deal with race and racism. And here we are. Are we making progress? Is this an echo? What do you, as you look back as a historian, as a cultural historian, what are you thinking about where we are?
You know, a quote wiser heads than mine on this, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, points out that, you know, the arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it twangs back a lot of the time. I mean, his book about what happened during Reconstruction, and the reaction to that is, I mean, I guess it's profoundly depressing, but you can take some consolation, because I think, we're living in, to some extent, in the reaction to the first black president, the first black first family, and we're having a huge retrograde step right now. I mean, it couldn't be, just even being in this building and being aware of the shonda that was the firing of Dr. Carla Hayden. For what? Because she was a black woman, and all of the reaction to diversity and inclusion. I mean, these are wonderful words. How can people be against it? What's the opposite?
Yeah.
Exclusion.
You've spent decades inhabiting generals, kings, abolitionists, prophets, all kinds of people, wielding power. How do you think about moral authority? How do you think about leadership? Where does that come from? Where might it come from again?
Where might it come from again? My writing life took a bit of a swerve last year when I was asked to help Kamala Harris with her book, 107 Days. And I'd never done anything like that before, but I was very glad to have that project, because it gave me a place to put my absolute rage and horror for a few months. I could get up every morning and think about what had happened and what could have happened and what needs to happen. And I've always been an optimist, and I hope to be an optimist again. And I think, the first Trump administration, I thought we can survive 4 years, but can we survive this 4? I'm not sure that the institutions. It's going to be a struggle. I was just walking past all the great arms of our wonderful public service, thinking about all the people who aren't in those buildings now, walking from my hotel to here, past FEMA, past the Department of Education, past the Voice of America, and thinking of all those people with so much talent, these mission-driven people who are not in this for themselves, who are in this to solve big problems that there's no money in, that private enterprise won't do, and that many of those problems are things that only the US can do. And just, to under the guise of eliminating waste, and then ballrooms, arches, slush funds, all the money that could have been spent keeping those talented people in their jobs. It's going to be a big rebuild, is all I'm saying, and I hope we get the chance to do it.
I want to give you a chance to talk about other writers for a moment. What writers gave you a sense of what fiction could do, really expanded your sense of what a novel could do?
Recently, The Overstory by Richard Powers, I finished that book and I looked at the world differently. And that is such an incredible gift. I love that a book can do that. I am a great admirer of Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. I think that is a perfect novel.
Agreed.
I think,
a previous winner of this prize.
Yes, and I was in your seat here on a panel appreciating Marilyn Robinson, quite a few years ago, but it was a wonderful experience. I was fangirling. But, in my own despised field of historical fiction, and it's not just Henry James. James Wood calls it a Jim Crack genre. So in my Jim Crack genre, when I was a teenager, I read Mary Renault, her Greek novels, and I just, I loved what she did there, because she could take you to a different time and place and cosmology, way of thinking, value set, and yet her characters lived and breathed and were relatable, and so that was a kind of a role model for me. But I think the absolute epitome of the genre is the Wolf Hall trilogy by the late Hilary Mantel. I love those books. I feel like you read those books and it's as if she were Thomas Cromwell in a past life. I mean, you can feel the nap of the velvet, and you see the mist rising off the Thames, and as he ducks and weaves his perilous way through that uncertain political time, it is just a masterpiece.
It really is. It really is. What can you tell us about what to expect from you next?
So I am working on a novel which is taking longer than I thought it would. It's a novel, you ask how you get, call back to your earlier question, how do you get an idea for a novel? In 2018, Tony was invited to give a talk on historical memory at Oxford, and it was a wonderful conference addressing the question of how do you memorialize bad things, essentially, and he was talking about Confederate memory and so forth. And we just had a fantastic time in that city of surpassing medieval beauty, and we immediately started to conspire about how we could get back there and spend more time. And I remember walking through one of the dining halls and looking at one of the refectory tables, and there are all these scratches and pen marks, and I started to think of all the conversations that had happened at that table. And so last year I got a visiting researcher's gig at New College, Oxford, which I just love because it was new in the 14th century. And so that's what I'm working on now.
Oh, can't wait. Would you be willing to take some questions from the audience? There are 2 microphones here. Just come up. It's a little hard for us to see, but please come up to the microphone and just begin when you're...
And be shy. It's always hard for the first one.
Oh, they're turning off the light. Did it get darker here or lighter there?
Well, we've knocked them all into a stupor.
Not at all. They're just a little intimidated. Here are people.
Hi, I'm Robin, a Capitol Hill resident, and I can attest to all your horror that's going on around here. I have a question at the end of Horse. Why did you
Speak a little bit closer?
Yeah, why did you choose at the end of Horse to reiterate the fact that things have not changed, that we cannot get over, we cannot be more optimistic about the status of racial equality?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Can you just speak a little closer?
Yeah, why did you decide at the end of Horse to make it so they didn't have racial equality in today? Why did you decide not to go to the dark side and not give us hope?
So because I think it would have been untrue to the moment that we live in. When I was writing that book, the drumbeat of horror was very loud. I was writing that book when, George Floyd's breath was crushed out of him, when Ahmaud Arbery was shot while running, while Sandra Bland was put face down on the ground because she didn't turn her blinker on to make a turn, and died in police custody. When Breonna Taylor, lying in bed, was shot. There are two young black protagonists in that book, and when I was first setting out to be a novelist, I read a wonderful book on writing a novel, and I can't remember the author's name, which is shocking, but there was a great piece of advice in it, which is your job as a novelist is to be pushing your protagonist's head underwater all the way through the novel, but by the time you get to the end, you have to decide whether you're going to sink them or let them swim. And I'm a big fan of the swim because I actually don't love it in a book if the author has spent 350 pages making you care about somebody and then they push them off the cliff on page 351. But with this book, because there were two young black protagonists, if one swam, I felt like the other one had to sink, because if they both swam, it would be untrue to the history of race.
Hello. I have to say, reading March around the time that you read it, Mr. Charles, was such a vivid and wonderful experience for me, and it revived my love for Little Women, and to the point where it became, like, it brought back this book from my childhood and really made it a part of my life going forward. And I wonder, do you have characters that are still living with you, that you're still thinking about, that might live a life beyond the books that they've been in?
Well, they do for me. Going all the way back to Year of Wonders, I had an entire life worked out for Anna after we leave her. And unfortunately, she dies in an earthquake, but, no, they do stay with me. Maybe Mr. March less so, because he could be kind of aggravating. I mean, I admire idealists, but they're hard to live with.
Thank you.
In your last book, why did you decide to do a nonfiction book? Since you've had so many fiction titles, what decided for you to do that?
Oh, so that Memorial Days was the book I wrote because I needed to write it. Basically, I needed to deal with losing Tony, and I hadn't dealt with it, and I realized, oh, you're a writer. Maybe you should write, and maybe that will help. So it was a book I wrote for myself, really, and it's been really touching because I've had more correspondence on that book than any other, and just a deluge of letters and emails from people about their own experiences of loss and grief. And the old newspaper reporter in me really does love reporting, and I also worked a year or so ago on the book, an essay for the book Who is Government, which was a project that Michael Lewis cooked up to find people in the public service who were doing extraordinary things. And I really loved the experience, and I thought, well, if this is going to be a defense of government, I'm going to defend the most unpopular branch. So I found somebody in the IRS. And I do, there is an itch there to do more nonfiction as well, but I can't do that until I finish The Table, so.
A question for both of you. What do you see now as the future of journalism, and what do you see for our future given the state of journalism?
I'm going to let you take that first, because you're...
It's gotten rather bleak for me lately. Now your turn.
Come on, you're very...
Find me on Substack.
Very recently in the trenches.
Wow. Yeah, the papers are dying at the very moment we need them most, right? I mean, it's just a terrible coincidence. The people that are charged with this responsibility are not rising to the occasion. I think it's incredibly unfortunate. But there are reasons to be encouraged. There are new papers starting, even in this city. There are new papers starting. There are excellent nonprofits being started. There are people thinking about journalism and how to make it work. I think your son's involved in a project like that. Very creative, things we've never seen before. So we will adjust and go on. We have to have journalism. We have to know what's going on to have a democracy. So we'll make it.
I think there's such good work being done. Journalists are still doing it, whether they're remunerated for it sufficiently or whether there's the kind, it's dispiriting to see a great paper like The Post shrinking in this way, and it shows the vulnerability of relying on feckless billionaires. But yeah, there are new models springing up. I don't live in New York. I don't even like New York particularly, but I love a publication called Hellgate, which is a bunch of young it's a co-op, and they're great. They cover the city in this incredibly lively, cheeky way. As you said, my son has an investigative newsroom which doesn't rely on ads or clicks or feckless billionaires. And he was concerned about the decline of investigative reporting at a time when we need it so much. And he's particularly interested in corporate malfeasance. And so he funds it by basically he managed to talk people into investing in a hedge fund. And they capture the value of their journalism by investing according to what they find out. And, for years, journalists have moved the stock market but not received any of the proceeds of that. And journalists have fed law firms by providing them with material for class action suits but not received any of the proceeds of that. So his model is, let's let the journalists capture the value of their own work.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I just wanted to start by thanking you for writing and for sharing these amazing stories with us. I can remember reading all of the books that you've written and where I was when I started reading them, and thinking about them many times afterwards. And I actually have to thank my 90-year-old mother, because she's the one who gave me your first book. And she heard I was coming here tonight, and she was like, tell her I just love her work. So I feel I have to do that.
Well, tell her I love her back.
And I'm excited because I have children of my own now who are also reading your books. So thank you. I'm interested in hearing about your process. How do you, I know you obviously do a lot of research and you use your journalism skills. And you've shared focusing on the truth and finding that and letting that kind of guide you. But from the day in, do you just start writing? Do you work from an outline? Is it different every time? I would be really curious to know.
So because I didn't I wasn't thinking novelist. I never took a creative writing class, so it's very instinctive for me, and I don't outline or anything like that. And also because I started it under the duress of having a kid, I guess my process was, how much babysitting can I afford? And if I have that 4 hours, if it's only 4 hours, you don't have writer's block, you just do. And then, happy day, the school bus arrives, and you've got a whole 6 hours. And I tended to, long after my kids needed me hovering over them in the afternoons, I tended to stop work when they got home and do something else, and found that that was very helpful, because if you get up from your desk when you've still got some juice, you're good to go the next day, but also problems resolve themselves when you look away. And I would often get my best ideas while I was, making dinner or something like that. And the best description of process is not mine. It comes from a sculptor friend of mine called Sarah Z, and she was asked by the New Yorker, no less, about her process, and she said, "My process is mess, 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 art." And I love that so much, because you cannot make art every day, but you can make a mess. And if you get up every day and work on that mess, you might get to art.
Hello, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. I have a question about your novel about King David, which falls, when I was reading it, it struck me that it falls in a long tradition of stories embellishing what happens in the scripture. And
Midrash.
Midrash, right. And I wondered if you would just talk about that influence on your approach to writing that wonderful book.
So that book was really hard. I was inspired to do it because my son conceived the desire when he was 8 years old that he was going to become a harpist. And it turns out it's a really great instrument for a kid to play, because you can't make a bad sound on it, even if you're playing it really badly. So nobody winces when you're practicing, and it's very encouraging. And then I thought, well, this will never survive his adolescence, because he's going to a pretty tough working class public school. And lo and behold, it was such a babe magnet. So he still plays. But while he was getting ready for his bar mitzvah, we spent a lot of time in shul, So I read a lot, and I found myself reading about King David, the young harpist, and I discovered that it really is the first political biography in history that's told from soup to nuts, because we meet him as a child, and we follow him through the most extraordinary human life, where every single thing that could happen to a person, the good and the bad, occurs. And then we follow him to his deathbed. Amazing. And I thought, I really want to write this, but he doesn't really exist outside the pages of Scripture. There's like one potsherd that references somebody that might have been him. So how do you research that? And how do you write in modern English that kind of somehow has a resonance of what Old Hebrew might have been like? I mean, it was really tough, and I'm never going back to the Second Iron Age again.
It has been such a pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much. Congratulations again.
Thank you.